I'm here with Brian Bennett. He is a former South Carolina law enforcement instructor. He is now retired, and he is a trainer and consultant in areas of domestic violence, strangulation, elder, vulnerable adults, and elder abuse. I mean, you do kind of the gambit of everything. And I've been working on a lot of stories, very difficult stories lately relating to individuals who had died. And there was prior history of domestic violence, strangulation specifically. And we connected online, and, it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I wanted to have a conversation about your experience, what you think can be done, and, how we can start doing better in South Carolina protecting people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sad that unfortunately it's only in October during Domestic Violence Awareness Month that we seem to have an emphasis on these type of issues. But the reality of it is that these issues of domestic violence and strangulation, particularly, happen every day, 365 days a year, all hours of the days and night, to many different people. And there needs to be an emphasis on this every day of the year because of how pervasive it is and how historically these types of assaults are repeated. And then ultimately, what they end up becoming, which is homicides. And obviously, that's not where we want to be. South Carolina is always in the top 10. The most recent number I saw was that we're number 6. We've always been in the top 10 for almost over 20 years. I think this strangulation issue, if we bring specific laser focus to it, South Carolina could dramatically reduce our number of domestic homicides. I'm not really one to focus on rates per se. We know that in spite of every effort, 100% effort that every entity, every profession can give, we know that we're still going to have domestic homicides. Unfortunately, it's the nature of it's human nature for some people to be evil. But let's do everything that we can do to reduce the numbers. And strangulation or indications of strangulation in a historical context are the number one indicator that a future homicide is going to occur. So when we pick up on these issues early on, we have a strong backing or a strong support to limit the number of homicides in South Carolina, domestic related specifically.
And it's not just an indicator for, homicides. It's an indicator for a lot of crimes like mass murders, and it's an indicator for a lot of things. So I think the legislation could do a lot in terms of preventing crime in general.
No, you're right. When we looked at numbers in South Carolina, 44% of other crimes are related to domestic violence. That was something that we found in the governor's domestic violence task force report from back in 2015, which I was co-chairman of one of those divisions. That's just looking at domestic violence, things like property damage, stalking, harassment, intimidation. 44% of other crimes just with domestic violence. But when you look particularly at strangulation nationally, what research has pointed to is that there, like you said, are a number of mass shooters who, when their history was checked, had patterns of strangling their intimate partners before committing mass shootings. And so when we say number one indicator of a homicide, well, the first thought that people come to is the targeted domestic violence victim survivor. But in reality, those homicides extend beyond what we call the household member definition or the intimate partner definition. Those homicides are also indicated of our law enforcement officers. The number of law enforcement officers who are ambushed and feloniously killed in the United States, there's a correlation between individuals who have a history of strangling and killing law enforcement officers or having to be shot by law enforcement officers. And then, so we have law enforcement officers, we have the public at large due to mass homicides, mass shootings. We have targeted domestic violence victims, but then we also have this collateral damage, people that don't meet the definition, like children, other children in the relationship, other family members that try to intervene, they aren't counted in some of the homicide statistics for domestic violence.
Right.
Sometimes it's only the targeted domestic violence victim and not the 2 or 3 children or the mother or the father or the brother or sister that tried to intervene at that time. So, again, the emphasis on the strangulation really is a safety issue for all South Carolinians and everyone nationally as well.
And we are, as a state, we are lacking in legislation. We are the only state in the United States that does not have legislation specific to strangulation, right?
That's correct. So let's talk about specifically about domestic violence. In 2015, South Carolina had the domestic violence reform that took place within the House of Representatives. Out of that 2015 Domestic Violence Reform Committee, strangulation language to some extent was added, but only specifically to domestic violence. The problem with that is strangulation was not specifically defined, and they allowed for graduated charges. So technically, under domestic violence law in South Carolina, you can strangle somebody and be charged with a misdemeanor tried in summary court. Well, that is not reflective of the true danger and the threat to someone's life that non-fatal strangulation actually is. And it also only focused on domestic violence. It did not consider strangulation, non-fatal strangulation against our vulnerable adults, our children, because children get strangled as well, sexual assault victims, kidnapping victims, and even human trafficking. You know, human trafficking is one of those hot button topics as well. And human trafficking victims are routinely strangled as well, because especially within the sex trade, the human trafficking victim is the physical commodity. And these traffickers, they don't want these individuals out covered in bruises. And as I'm sure we'll talk about later with some of the subtle signs and indicators, someone can be strangled almost to death and have no external injuries on their body. So South Carolina, as you said, is the last state left to specifically define a strangulation and have a strangulation law. Most states, not all, most states automatically qualify strangulation as a felony. And I can explain later when we get into the legal aspect why that needs to be the case. And that puts South Carolina in a very bad position in most regards, because that means we haven't recognized the danger. You know, if we know how dangerous something is, why would we not do everything we could to prevent it? For example, everybody knows how dangerous fentanyl is. Well, South Carolina relatively quickly passed a fentanyl trafficking law because everyone knows how dangerous fentanyl is. Well, most people don't know how dangerous strangulation is, and I think misinformation and lack of education has led us to being one of the last. Now, but here's the silver lining to it. If we are the last state, we have 49 other states to model from, and we can take the best aspects of those existing statutes and try to come up with the strongest legislation in the country to address this issue. So that's the silver lining to this, if there is one.
Yeah. And so, all right, if we do manage to get strangulation law legislation passed, what would the benefits be? You know, somebody who is accused of, strangling another person, regardless of, if it's somebody they live with, if it's somebody they're dating, if it's somebody, their mother, if it's an, child, they would be charged with strangulation and not just assault and battery, right?
Correct.
Okay.
So one of the benefits is tracking. I know victim safety and triage at the hospital is important, and I'm going to get to that, but let me address this issue first. In the Governor Haley, then at that time Governor Haley, by executive order, she formed the Domestic Violence Task Force. And what we found in our first phase research is that South Carolina has a very poor network to gather data. Our systems don't connect with each other. We speak different languages in our terminology and our vernacular. And so it's almost impossible to track strangulation specifically because it gets mixed in under other statutes and other charges with different language like choking and just, a series of words like hands on a neck. Well, you can't search for those things with the databases that we have.
Right.
So tracking and giving actual numbers for South Carolina has been incredibly difficult. Well, here's one of the benefits to having a specific strangulation statute. When you define it and you have a specific statutory code, now it's easy to track. And if you're going to introduce legislation, you want to see that the legislation is effective, or where it's not effective, to improve it later. Well, if we don't have something specific, it's going to get, as it is now, sometimes pushed under our different assault laws, or maybe our vulnerable adult statute, or a child protection statute, and it gets lost in the mix. And therefore, you're still left with no ability to track rates and improvements or deficiencies. So that's what I see as one of the main benefits, is specific tracking across different different job duties. For example, law enforcement, the solicitor's office, the judiciary, victim services, and hospital administration records and that sort of thing. So when you define it, when you have a specific code, it makes it so much easier for us to collect numbers and evaluate our work. The second thing it does is it would necessitate that everyone get trained on the signs, symptoms, and indicators of strangulation. Now, when I was an instructor at the State Police Academy, one thing that I decided to do was integrate non-fatal strangulation awareness into the basic training program for law enforcement officers. The hope is that they would have that base knowledge, and that the agencies would continue on with higher levels of advanced training, which I offered and I still offer. But what we also found, and what is startling, is that outside of law enforcement, there's no profession in South Carolina that has a standardized strangulation training curriculum. So you would expect that your nurses and your doctors might have some unique understanding of this, and the fact is they don't. Our forensic nurses do, or what we call our sexual assault nurse examiners or forensic nurses do, because they have a specific curriculum. But when you look at the curriculum for our medical field as a whole, paramedics, EMTs, again, nurses, doctors, they don't understand the signs, symptoms, and indicators. They haven't been taught the dangers, and they haven't been taught the imaging recommendations to triage those victims and to collect evidence. And then when you get to our prosecutors and our judiciary, they don't have that either. And so all the people that have a power to intervene, most of them don't have any awareness themselves. So how can they bring awareness to someone else?
Right.
And so I think the statute would necessitate, it can't mandate, but it can necessitate these different professional designations to develop training curriculum so that they can be in compliance with the law for not just criminal justice purposes, but for victim and patient care.
Right. I talked to a victim of domestic violence yesterday, and she had been in the hospital after assaults 3 times, including strangulation. And the third time was the first time a nurse picked up on what had happened and got her out of the situation. And that's, that wasn't even South Carolina. That was a Maine, in a state that does have legislation. But, it did drive home the importance of training across the board, and, how this can prevent tragedies.
And I think that's a perfect example of, even though this particular individual went to the hospital, were they given the necessary and proper advisements? And, ultimately the third time, perhaps yes, but the 2 previous times could have actually caused her death.
Right.
And, nationally, statistically, if you take 100 substantiated cases of strangulation, only about 3 of those cases ever get to the hospital. And even out of those 3, out of 100, those 3 don't often get the triage care and advisements that they need. And so sometimes, even under the best of circumstances, we can be deficient, but we have to do something. We have to start somewhere to improve the response.
We have to make
I think the
circumstances. We have to make them the best.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's really what I call the frontline people that have the greatest amount of influence and the greatest ability to recognize what's going on than the third or fourth person down the chain.
Right.
We can't expect a a victim, and I say victim, it's not to minimize or diminish
Right.
individuals. Statutorily, under the law, they're called victims, but personally, we call them survivors. So that's why I
Right.
say victim survivors. We can't expect victim survivors to tell us what we need to know. We need to know what we need to know so that we can ask the right questions to gain clarity and then offer the proper resolutions from that.
Right. Are there any downsides? So when strangulation legislation is being proposed, are there pushbacks? Are there downsides to this legislation that
Mm.
you anticipate?
Well, let's give everybody historical context of what South Carolina has done up to now. Um, Approximately 7 to 8 years ago, myself and a few other individuals, we drafted the first bill, non-fatal strangulation bill for South Carolina, and that was sponsored by Senator Katrina Shealy out of Lexington. That first attempt in the 2 year legislative session didn't get any discussion whatsoever because as some people may or may not be aware, when bills are filed, they're discussed and they're put on like a rank of what's most important, and discussions in our General Assembly get things pushed to the top or pushed to the bottom. Well, it didn't even make it on the list, quite frankly. The second time we introduced a bill, which was also sponsored by Katrina Shealy, we made some modifications to the language, and we did get a discussion within the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee. But that discussion literally only lasted about 5 minutes. It did not give us the proper time to really vet out and discuss it. But to their credit, they did move it into the full Judiciary Committee, which is a closed meeting. But in that 3 hour meeting, only about 7 minutes was devoted to the strangulation bill. And quite frankly, members of our legislature who happen to be defense attorneys are the ones that were most resistant to it, as it was unnecessary and unneeded. And I'll let people draw their own conclusions as to why they argue that. But effectively, that bill was tabled. And then the most recent bill, which was in the last couple of years, which was House Bill 3684, thankfully that was sponsored by House Rep Rob Harris, who happens to have a nursing background. He understood it. It didn't get any traction either. It wasn't even discussed. I mean, it was put on the pre-filed bills, but it didn't go anywhere. So there have been measures and attempts to bring this before our General Assembly, and probably within the last year, uh, the greatest amount of information has been given to members of our Senate to actually explain the problem in South Carolina, what the dangers are associated with it, and what the benefits are. But what I see personally is the biggest pushback is that it is unnecessary, that it's not needed. We have existing laws that address this, and I would argue absolutely not. We don't. And what is evidence of this is when you look at cases of strangulation, which the media often calls choking, we can talk about that terminology later. It shows a glaring inconsistency in the charges filed, the sentencing that is handed out as it relates to someone being strangled. You see everything from no charges at all to misdemeanor level charges. Sometimes you see felony level charges. That's usually when someone essentially has either died, obviously, or was almost dead. But there's a lot of inconsistency. And one way to alleviate that is the statute. But the argument is, well, we don't need it. Well, officers and solicitors' offices can necessarily apply the existing law to these instances. Well, apparently not.
Right.
Because when you're strangled, uh, that is someone trying to take the breath from your body to that has a potentially a deadly impact on your life. That's serious. And so and I'm getting kind of technical here because I know the law. We have some terminology in our assault laws called great bodily injury. Uh, as I might be able to explain later, when you understand how deadly and how dangerous non-fatal strangulation is, it absolutely meets the definition of great bodily injury. So if we know how dangerous it is, even within the great bodily injury language in our existing laws, we should be filing felony level charges, even under assault laws. But again, when you look at cases, that doesn't bear out. There's
Right.
inconsistency. I mean, I've got 50 cases that I've gleaned from the media in the last few years, and relatively few of those 50 cases were ever felony charges. Some of them weren't, they were misdemeanor assault charges, and some of them weren't even assault charges. And then when you get into the issues of getting into court and plea bargains being arranged, and someone maybe being charged with a felony level assault, but then being able to plead to a disorderly conduct or some misdemeanor charge or a non-domestic violence conviction, that creates a lot of problems.
Right.
That creates a lot of problems for historical tracking and showing patterns of abuse and threat to other people.
Right. Strangulation is, in terms of methodology, it's a scary crime. I mean, it's very personal. Most of the time when the person is doing it, they are looking you in the eye. It's a frightening crime. It's fright. I mean, I've talked to a lot of survivors, and it's a frightening experience. It changes you.
Yeah. And, and this is where I can tie a little bit of the law into this understanding. It shouldn't take a law for people to understand that this is dangerous. And I'll tell you why. This is an example I give everybody. Every individual person inherently knows that lack of air, without air, you will die. Everybody knows that. Even babies who put their head underwater will eventually struggle to put their head above water because of that need for oxygen, because oxygen gives us life. So when someone is strangled, it's a very close up and personal form of assault. It's, if somebody's across a field shooting a pistol or a rifle across the street, that's certainly deadly. Strangulation is just as deadly, but it is much more intimate, much more personal, and much more physically and emotionally traumatic to the people that it's a very personal crime. And as you correctly stated, when you talk to victims and survivors about this, it's something that they can't even put into words. And this is why we don't like to use the word choking. Because choking mechanically and technically is the incorrect term. It's actually strangulation. Choking is a accidental internal blocking of the airway. Strangulation is a form of asphyxiation characterized by external pressure on the veins and arteries in the airway of the neck, thereby depriving the brain and the body of needed oxygen. Choking minimizes the physical violence, and it minimizes the danger of what someone can actually experience, and that is ultimately death. And so when people say, well, it's not that serious, well, again, I just say, hey, so if it's not that serious, hold your head underwater until you pass out or die. Do you think that's not serious? And people start to realize, oh, I have this inherent understanding.
Right. So one thing, with strangulation, somebody who strangles somebody, it feels like attempted murder.
Mm-hmm.
Their intent isn't just to harm them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, where does it cross that line?
Yeah, well, and so this has been another debate in South Carolina. There have been cases of non-fatal strangulation that were charged with attempted murder. With respect to making those specific charges, sometimes what is considered is not just what was done, but also what was said and what the perceived intent was. So whenever you look at some strangulation cases, some of the arguments made by the criminal defendant is, well, I didn't know it was dangerous, or I wasn't going to kill him. I just wanted them to be quiet. And that creates a little bit of a problem sometimes. And that's why sometimes the charges are not attempted murder. So if you take a different scenario where perhaps strangulation has taken place in either a third party or the victim themselves or the suspect themselves made a statement like, you're going to die today, or this will be the last time you see the light of day. Well, those words accompanied by the actions show intent.
Okay.
And the attempted murder charge a lot of times has a lot of weight on proving the intent of the criminal defendant.
Okay.
And if the proof of proving intent is weak, sometimes that attempted murder charge is not made. It's not an
Okay.
absolute. I think, personally, I think attempted murder is the absolute appropriate charge in every situation. Again, because of the inherent understanding of every person that oxygen to your body is necessary to have life.
Right.
So somebody said, "What? I didn't know." Well, what do you mean you didn't technically know that that would kill somebody? You didn't technically know or medically know that that would do harm to a person's body? No, you did. You just didn't have the medical background to a medical degree to say that, but you inherently knew it. I think attempted murder, and this is what I always promoted with our law enforcement officers and with our prosecutors. If you can make the attempted murder charge, that is exactly where you need to go.
Right.
But if that's not on the table, this is where I think the strangulation law steps up and fills a gap that is
Okay.
desperately needed.
That makes sense. So in terms of what you're doing now, I mean, you're traveling across the state, training
Mhm.
law enforcement, medical professionals on strangulation, on other things as well, but on strangulation, what to look for, what are some of the things that you include in your training?
Well, first of all, we talk about why there isn't the public awareness. Because, again, as I stated at the beginning, I think if public awareness was raised and people's eyes were opened, we would see a recognition of much higher rates than what we know now. But again, because of lack of specific curriculum, lack of coverage in the media, lack of like public service announcements and everything, people just don't know how dangerous it is. Even the victims themselves and the professionals that interact with them. We do a really great job of talking about domestic violence in October. We do a great job of talking about DUI and drunk driving, awareness. We do a good job of talking about human trafficking regularly, but how often do we really talk about domestic violence and strangulation? It needs to be happening every year. So that's one thing I cover is why is there no public awareness, and also it relates to misinformation. Using the word choking versus strangulation. Things also misinformation in what was taught 20 years ago. What we were taught 20, 25 years ago about strangulation was that somebody's going to have marks on them. When someone's strangled, you'll see petechial hemorrhages in the whites of their eyes, these little burst capillaries, and they'll have marks on their neck. That was bad research and that was bad science. What we know now is that the frequency of you seeing external injuries is actually lower than what we thought. The increased frequency of more subtle signs and symptoms is more frequent. So let me give you an example. About 50% of strangulation cases, the victim will have no external injuries visible on their body. Even in fatal cases of strangulation, about 50% of the time, there will be no external injuries on the body. And that means that by relying on our visual training or training to use our eyes, we're missing more than half because we're looking externally. So what I train is to consider other signs and symptoms that indicate internal injury. So some of those more subtle but more frequent indicators is a change or altered voice. Because of this area being damaged, it can change or alter someone's ability to project their voice or their regular tone of voice that they talk in. Might be higher, might be lower, but it's about 50% of the time it's altered in some way. We also have breathing difficulty. It might be wheezing, whistling from that airway being damaged or starting to swell. Trouble swallowing, trouble breathing. There could also be also just holding the neck or holding the head, the head hurting, the neck hurting. There's also short-term memory loss as well. And that is one thing that really causes a lot of problems, is because uh, people in the criminal justice field expect victims to be able to relate what happened. Well, loss of consciousness, what we call LOC, there's indications of a loss of consciousness where the brain did not have enough oxygen, and so therefore it didn't develop a memory. It is common for victims, survivors, to not remember what happened during that strangulation event when they lose consciousness. So they might say something like, I remember being over here and this happening up until a point, but then I woke up on the ground, or I woke up in the ditch, or I woke up in the bathroom. Well, that indicates loss of consciousness. That indicates something was going on with the brain. Again, you may see nothing on the neck, no marks or injuries, but they're indicating that they don't have a memory. For some people, that ties to credibility. It's like, if you don't have any injuries on your neck and you can't tell me a story, then it didn't happen. That's not actually true. That's not a good way to look at it.
Right.
There's also vision changes. Again, I don't know what the victim experienced with their vision when they were going through it. But if I ask them, what things did you see? What did you experience? Sometimes they talk about seeing little stars like shoot around their face. We all have experienced that, and not from strangulation, but sometimes we
Bend
stand up
over.
too
Yeah.
fast, or we bend over, and we see these little stars. Well, that is some optic nerve interaction with our brain. Well, strangulation victims can also say things like, well, I lost color. Everything turned to shades of gray, or I lost my peripheral vision, or it looked like I was looking through a tunnel. These would all be indicators. We also have involuntary urination and defecation on oneself. When your brain is deprived of oxygen and is becoming damaged due to lack of oxygen, your autonomic functions, your automatic functions in your body don't work right, and so you lose and you develop incontinence. The muscles that control your bladder and your rectum relax, and so victims may involuntarily urinate or defecate on themselves. Now, that brings up the issue too of, when officers, whoever gets there, are they in those clothes that they were in, or have they been disposed of? And often, out of a embarrassment, those clothes have been thrown away and disposed of, and no one asks where they are or why that occurred. And so those are just some of the more subtle signs and symptoms. But the one thing I want people to remember is, if you're expecting to see marks on somebody, 50% of the time you're not. And you're going to have to pick up on these other subtle signs and symptoms.
So if they do pick up on other subtle signs, what do they do? What is the next step? If they do, or if they're picking up like me, I got a feeling here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So ideally, the professionals, again, expecting our victim survivors to have this information or have this knowledge would be a rare thing right now. With public information, that would improve, where they could almost somewhat triage themselves to a degree. But as of right now, we have to rely on our professionals and our experts. And so if there is an indication of strangulation, the immediate protocol that should take place is getting to the hospital. When you look at your criminal justice, your law enforcement officers, yes, we have a desire to hold offenders accountable and charge people, but the number one concern at that point is patient care and triage. So a lot of states who've instituted a strangulation statute have also instituted strangulation screening protocols. In other words, a way for professionals to evaluate the situation, and when there's indication of strangulation, getting this person immediately to the hospital. Now, to be fair, not every victim survivor wants to go to the hospital because they're worried about, perhaps embarrassment. They're also worried about bills, hospital bills. They're also worried about transportation. That should be something that they don't have to worry about. But we know that it's a worry. They also have an understanding that perhaps when they go to the hospital, there may be some disclosure that takes place or some evidence that points to who did it, and they're trying to avoid further abuse. But what we have to do is we have to speak in reality, and we have to speak in a very direct way. I'm not one to want to cause fear, but this is directly related to their life. And so, in discussing with these victims the need, we have to say, look, your life is at risk. If we are indicating that you may have been strangled without immediate medical intervention, you could suffer some permanent injury or death weeks or even months from now. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. You can die from a strangulation weeks or months after the event without appropriate medical care. So, a lot of times, if we educate them on the dangers and they realize that self preservation is in their benefit, they're more apt to get that medical intervention. And so that's step number one, which then leads us to the hospital and having the forensic nurses and the available to do the appropriate exams. And those forensic nurses don't just do triage and patient care, but they also are our evidence collection people that are able to gather information that can be turned over to law enforcement for criminal justice purposes. So, yeah, when we see these subtle signs and symptoms, I tell everybody, you got to get them to the hospital. Do whatever you can. You can't force them. You can't drag them against their will, but do everything you can to point out that it's in their overall benefit health-wise. Don't even get into the prosecution or who's going to be charged. Hey, you need to take care of you. We want to take care of you. Let's get you to the hospital.
Okay, that makes sense. Are there other aspects of the training that you think, like in terms of, statutes and, handling the scene that are helpful as you're walking through this training?
Most people are too lazy to do this, but it saves homeowners a fortune. I worked in construction for 20 years now, and it shocks me how many people pay a fortune to upgrade their gutters when there are services like the Gutter Remodel Relief Service. As long as you own your home, you can apply for and get approved for an affordable gutter transformation within 2 minutes. You can click the button below and find out almost instantly if you're eligible. I've done this for hundreds of my clients over the years, but still so many people will pay $2,500 for new gutter systems without knowing it. The best part is that there is zero cost to apply for the service. The only downside is not every zip code is covered, but I know there are still spots available, so I would try immediately. You can find out in minutes if you're approved. Click the link below to learn more. There's literally nothing to lose.
Yeah, so again, because we don't have a strangulation law right now, I have to work within the confines of the laws that we do have. So when I'm presenting all this, and a lot of it is kind of medical information, because in order for people to understand the dangers, they have to understand what's going on inside the body
Right.
to realize those dangers. So beyond that, when we realize and we establish that this strangulation, every strangulation is potentially lethal immediately or in the weeks ahead, we have to understand that depending on the victim, survivor, we may have to pull from the statutes that currently exist to give the appropriate charge. So again, within domestic violence, we look at what's called domestic violence of a high and aggravated nature.
Mm-hmm.
That's the highest level of domestic violence in South Carolina. That's about as close to attempted murder as you can get. But the language in there says that restriction of air or blood flow must cause loss of consciousness. Well, what if the victim didn't lose consciousness?
Right.
And see, that hamstrings law enforcement making that charge, because what we know is you don't have to lose consciousness to die later from a strangulation.
Right.
But so within domestic violence, we promote, look for any indication of loss of consciousness or stupor. Within the non-household member definition, we look at our different levels of assault and that great bodily injury. Can we, with what we know about strangulation, can we apply the evidence and what we see and what we've been told to support a great bodily injury risk? And that's another thing that people of the law may not understand. You don't actually have to create great bodily injury. Even the potential for great bodily injury can subject you to a felony charge under assault. And then with respect to our child protective statutes or our vulnerable adult protective statutes, which most of those are felonies anyway. So law enforcement and prosecutors have a selection or a list to go through. But again, it's not always the correct charge is not always made.
Right.
And here we are back to why we need the strangulation statute by itself.
Do you find when you're doing trainings with, first responders, do you find they're receptive to this? Are they surprised by the information you're giving them? Like before talking to you, I had no clue, the statistics behind this and, the risks that these offenders bring to the community.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'll share my experience, and I'll share the experience told to me by first responders. When I got my first entry level training into non-fatal strangulation awareness and prosecution and evidence collection, the first thing that came to my mind was past cases that I had already dealt with where I realized strangulation was part of it and I didn't get it. I had specific cases and people in my mind as a law enforcement officer that I was like, that's what I saw. That's what was going on, and I didn't get it. And because I didn't get it, the right charges weren't made and the right care wasn't given. And I felt guilty, but I didn't know what I didn't know. Right. And so when I present to first responders, the first thing that I kind of get from them is I did not realize how dangerous this was. I didn't realize that some of the things that you said, I saw in other cases before today, and I didn't get it. And what are those victim survivors suffering now because I didn't know any better? And so that one is that realization is they just didn't realize how dangerous it was. But then also for themselves related to assaults and killing against law enforcement officers, they're like, I never thought about, that if somebody was strangling other people, that would be the person most likely to kill me too.
Yeah, domestic violence calls are they're the scariest calls for a law enforcement officer. You don't know what you're walking into.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, law enforcement's a dangerous profession anyway. Even the most innocent of calls have led to officers being killed. But when officers, again, have dealt with victims who've indicated strangulation, that officer now knows I can help save this victim survivor, and I can help save myself and other law enforcement officers because I know who I'm dealing with now. I know their capabilities and I know what they're willing to do. And so that's usually what I get is just that their mind is blown, just like mine. I was like, I cannot believe that I didn't know this sooner, and what can I do to make it better from here on out? And that's kind of what my drive has been is to improve where we have been and what we were told years ago.
So legislatively, are you going to keep going at it? Like, are you going to try to get more traction?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I'm not giving up. I mean, this is something that is absolutely necessary for South Carolina. I just don't think South Carolina has woken up yet. I do think, and credit to you for being a member of media. I don't know if you would call yourself that, but I certainly call you that. And there's not very many media outlets who are willing to cover this topic. I think as public awareness grows, there will be a greater and greater demand for accountability with our General Assembly to do what they can to protect South Carolina across the board, not just related to domestic violence, but our law enforcement officers, our public at large. I'm not giving up. We've got more movement now than we ever have. Years ago, we didn't have a strangulation task force. We have one now. It was created by some other individuals, but for the purpose of bringing attention to this across disciplines and then moving us forward into the future legislatively, but also within respect to professional standards, whether it's, whether you're a nurse, you're a doctor, you're a victim advocate, let's develop some standards of advisement and follow-up care and advice for people that indicate with strangulation. And this is something a lot of people don't know. Back during our first bill, we collected 10,000 signatures. I've got them. I've got 10,000 signatures of South Carolinians who were in support of that strangulation bill the first time it was introduced, almost 7, 8, 9 years ago. I am certain there would be a lot more than 10,000. 10,000 should have made a statement, but for some reason it didn't. Myself and other individuals are out there every week trying to talk about this, trying to bring it up, trying to bring attention to the issue. And I'm not giving up, because the lives of South Carolinians are at risk if we don't do something. Why would we not do something when we know how dangerous it is?
There's only so many stories I can write where, it's a homicide and you're writing the story and you're researching the past. And just in the 6 months, I can think of 3 where, the victim had been had been strangled.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, it's over and over. It's repetitive. And
Yeah.
I can't figure out why we're not doing more. I mean, thank you for doing more, because it's important.
Yeah, and I know we're kind of beating a dead horse and being repetitive, but again, this goes back to why I think the strangulation statute is needed for tracking purposes.
Right.
You and I and other individuals who look into this are fortunate to have found indications of strangulation events preceding these homicides. But we've been lucky because we've been diligent. People that are less diligent are not going to find these patterns of history. And but again, the more and more you look into it, the more frequent you realize that it is. We have documents and we have reports, and we have news and media outlets that are kind of on the record, but I can't tell you how many times I've had personal conversations with people that never made a report to the police, that never took anything to the media, that tell me over and over and over, I was strangled, my mom was strangled, my sister was strangled, my friend was strangled. It is everywhere. It is everywhere. And, to bring this kind of around on the ability to find this pattern, in the 2015 Domestic Violence Reform Bill, it mentioned, or what was put in there was a mandatory incident report for domestic violence incidents. The reason for that was so that law enforcement and solicitors in the judiciary across South Carolina would be able to look at a domestic violence incident in a historical context to get a better understanding of what occurred before law enforcement intervention. Sometimes when law enforcement gets there, there's been a 5-year history of domestic violence, but only known to the 2 people in the house. But what is scary is since that bill was passed into law, there's still law enforcement agencies out there that aren't doing incident reports for domestic violence.
Home run! That's my girl!
She's a star.
Yeah, since I started giving her children's Claritin, she can actually play without allergies getting in the way.
I should try that. My boy's over there, sneezing in the batter's box.
Oh, you should. It's pediatrician recommended and provides 24-hour non-drowsy relief. Plus, the chewables are dye-free.
So he can focus on his swing instead of his symptoms.
Exactly. He'll be hitting home runs in no time.
Claritin clears. Use as directed.
So there we're stuck with another issue of limiting our ability to track patterns in a historical context for domestic violence. We're not even talking about strangulation,
Right.
And that's something that obviously needs improvement, is that tracking ability. And so yeah, this is something that I hope going forward, you and I and others can speak with more certainty on, because we see it.
Right.
We've seen it in documents, but we need those incidents that kind of happen on the periphery to become part of the foundation of understanding. And public awareness is definitely part of that, for sure.
Well, I'm glad to help with that. I can't think of anything more important than protecting people. I mean, it just seems like such a simple thing to do. Like, let's do it.
And I was thinking, I'd like to bring up a point, if I might, that perhaps, or I don't know that it's been an argument as of yet, but with relating to the strangulation statute, or not statute yet, hopefully we have one,
Fingers
a
crossed.
strangulation bill, there is a glaring inconsistency with something in South Carolina related to this. People say, well, what are you talking about? All right, here it is. When I'm trying to talk to members of our General Assembly and other people about inconsistency, they want an example. Here's the perfect example. In 2023, a law enforcement reform bill was passed into law. In that law, it states that law enforcement officers cannot use neck restraints or chokeholds unless it constitutes deadly force. So what that means is our General Assembly has recognized that neck holds, chokeholds, and neck restraints are inherently deadly. Otherwise, it wouldn't be qualified as deadly force. So how is it that we have a statute that limits the use of those holds to our law enforcement officers unless deadly force is authorized, but we don't apply that same standard across the board to anyone else who uses that in a criminal way?
That's a really good
And
point.
when I brought that to the attention of some of our General Assembly, they're like, I never thought of that. Well, I'm like, well, hopefully you think about that and consider more that this bill that would become a law is actually needed.
It just makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, they've already recognized it, but they don't recognize it within the realm of a law enforcement use. It doesn't, when someone's being strangled, it doesn't matter who the person is. Strangulation is strangulation.
Mm-hmm.
It should not be related to their title, either official title or a title by any other person, victim, survivor, police officer, whatever. The body doesn't know. The only thing the body is relating to is this pressure and the restriction of, the oxygen to the brain, which, and with that being said, and I hope I'm not going on a tangent here, there is 25 known medical complications with being strangled. 25 known medical complications. I'm sure there are more, but 25 that have been researched and substantiated. But the number one organ that is damaged during a strangulation is the brain.
Mm-hmm. Lack of oxygen.
Yeah. The brain is the number one organ first and most adversely affected by lack of oxygen. And so it's deadly, and we need to recognize it as such.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down to talk to me about this. You know that I am a huge supporter of this legislation and am happy to help you get the word out, help you build awareness of how much it's needed. I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
No, it's my pleasure. And if people want to kind of follow up on legislative updates and training and information, I do have a Facebook group page called Strangulation Law for SC. Strangulation Law for SC is not spelled out South Carolina. Doing a general search on there, you'll probably see it. It's got a little image of a thermal image of an individual who was strangled. So I put stuff on there related to South Carolina, our legislative efforts, speaking and training engagements, and then just links to videos and stuff for more training and understanding to really share with anybody, quite frankly.
And you're getting a YouTube channel started too.
I am. I'm going to be starting a YouTube channel. It's going to be called Sacred Mission. It's not specifically focused on strangulation and domestic violence, but it will focus on issues of personal safety, awareness, and advisements for people that are in any type of position that need help and don't know what to do, how to do it, or where to go.
I'm excited for all that. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today, and I will look forward to talking to you again soon.
Sounds great. It was a pleasure. Thank you.